officially, hello everybody. Great that we already heard from some of you. Thank you so much, Touria and 154, for inviting us, Julia and I. My name is Yvette Mutumba. This is Julia Grosse. We are the co-founders and editors-in-chief of the art magazines Contemporary and Contemporary and America Latina. And we are very happy to moderate this talk tonight. We have three very amazing ladies, and we're very happy that we can share this platform with you. And yes, we are also in a very specific moment right now. I mean, there's the Corona crisis, but there's also a lot of going on in the US, and it has, you know, the waves have reached Europe. And I think especially those of us who have been doing the work that we do for many years have also a lot of questions that come with that. And also a lot of questions that we want to ask institutions that haven't done that work for a long time. In another conversation, came this quote up to say that requests now have to become requirements. And I think this is a very good point to make, that this might be or should be the moment after many decades now to look at the structures that we all know very well within the art world. And so what we're going to do is Julia's going to briefly introduce our three panelists, and then we just dive right in with some questions. The panelists will be around 45 minutes, and then we have a little bit more time left for your questions, which you can leave in the chat there. Okay.
Next to the car park comments,
yes.
etc.
Exactly.
Which we're gonna love to answer as well if you like. So yeah, welcome and thanks so much for the invitation as well from my side. As Yvette said, it's a quite urgent, pressing moment and topics we all talking and thinking and reading about every minute. It feels like this. And this evening's topic is the question how to challenge institutions to break their exclusive structures. And in a way, this is not a new question to us because we've been asking these questions, the institutions, for years. And in a way, maybe it's now, or maybe it is a good moment to say, okay, this is a different moment from maybe, I don't know, the last years or from 3-4 years ago. Maybe we can't go back in time, which would, or can't go back, which would be amazing. Maybe things are finally changing and sustainable changes will maybe start now. So this is what we want to discuss with you, ladies. So first of all, I'm going to introduce our three panelists in alphabetical order. I start with Sepake Angiama is the artistic director of the Institute for International Visual Art, Iniva in London. Angiama's praxis stems from radical pedagogies, Black feminist poetics, rethinking human, non-human relation, and roots itself in how we might imagine and inhabit the world otherwise. Previously, she was the co-curator of the third Chicago Architecture Biennial and head of education at Documenta 14 and Manifesta European Biennial of International Art. Welcome. Born and raised in Morocco, Touria El Glaoui completed her education in New York before beginning a career in the banking industry as a wealth management consultant. After 10 years in the field, she relocated to London, where she initiated 154 Contemporary African Art Fair in 2013. She has since launched the fair in New York in 2015, as well as in Marrakesh in 2018. Hello, thanks so much again for the invitation. And Linett Kamala is an artist, educator, and director of Lin Kam Art. Her passion for enriching the lives of others through art, well-being, and education is demonstrated by partnerships with numerous organizations spanning over 30 years. Deeply rooted in community empowerment, her socially engaged creative practice ranges from developing school leaders to taking up space through carnival culture. Linett is also president of the University of the Arts London alumni of Colour Association and board director of the fantastic Notting Hill Carnival, which I find Amazing. So thanks so much, ladies, and thanks so much for inviting us. And I'm going to dive into the first question, starting with a quote. The New York-based art critic Antoine Sargent recently wrote in a statement for CN. Coming back closer. He wrote in a statement for CN, quote, "The museums now posting Black Lives Matter are the same ones who have participated in the social death of Black folks. Mm. Do Black Lives Matter on your curatorial team or board? Do they matter in your collections and shows?" Quote. And I was wondering, or asking all three of you, how do you see the current situation? Are institutions in the US, in Europe, in London socially responsible to, in a way, by having stayed passive on structural racism for too long? Who wants to start?
Well, it's a big question.
Yes, true.
I mean, I think the question I have is maybe more about why have we waited so long to make demands, maybe. That's also. So then it took me down a path of thinking about, you know, am I complicit actually in not making demands more visible? And, you know, sadly, it's taken the kind of coronavirus, which I think actually started to make the fault lines more visible within our societies.
Yeah.
And especially at the record number of Black and brown communities who are affected by this. So I think this was one aspect that I think was really a universal experience. I think we all witnessed that, and you could not unwitness it, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, I think to then also bear witness to the murder of George Floyd. But I have to say, even in the lead up to that, there were some other, you know, key, I think, incidences that I think were adding to the pressure pot.
Absolutely.
So, I think in some way you might describe it as the epicenter, and you know, from there was a rupture and a ripple that kind of we felt across the world. But if anything, in each of our localities, in each of our geographies, there are social injustices that that actually some people have been voicing for a very long time. And whether it goes unheard or if it, I don't know, is kind of seen somehow as something that just happens, that's just part of life. But I think it's become really clear that this isn't a way that we can continue.
Yes.
And of course, its roots go far, far. You know, we can go back to this 1492 moment where basically, you know, capitalism and racism are enshrined, and any institution that comes after that is part of that. There's a lot of work to do, you know.
Absolutely. Linett, maybe
I had a chance to read about those numbers, and I think that was a talk maybe, you know, during one of the scandal of the Whitney Biennale in New York, and I think they had done, I think the American Association Museum organization, a survey already at that time, which was I think 2 years ago, and the numbers were 4% of African American in you know, curators, you know, high administrators, educators, you know, in museums. And those questions were raised. And I mean, for me, who started this fair with this mission of inclusion, you know, of artists from the African continent or the, you know, the African diaspora, this is you know, things that we've seen coming up quite often. Now, maybe the difference, I think, with what's happening right now, what Sepake said, is that there's definitely a demand for action rather than, you know, just And I think this is maybe the real difference, because those topics, you know, we've heard, we've seen already, like at least during my life of 154, they came about several times, you know, and we're still dealing with the same requests. So now it's no more a request, it's an action.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to say certainly, you know, there's without a doubt a sense of urgency now. I think all the things that have been mentioned around the current COVID-19, the fact that people have been in a way forced to be still to notice this is, as we've said before, this isn't new, we know this. But there's something different about the fact that so many people, and of course we have technology as well, that's made a big difference as well to things. But if we talk about institutions, one of the areas that clearly that I've done a lot and mainly working with is in the education institutions, particularly with the British system. And we can go right back. I mean, I'm a child of Jamaican immigrants. I was born in the United Kingdom. I grew up in the 1970s, you know, so I say that because on the one hand, there has been significant change and progress from just what I experienced as a child and people, you know, generations before. But in saying that, there's also this feeling that here we go again in terms of this also, in a way, for me, doesn't quite feel new, if that makes sense. So, you know, thinking back to seminal texts such as Bernard Conrad's How the West Indian Child Is Made Education is Subnormal in the British school system, for example, that was back in the 1960s, you know, and if you look at what was being spoken about then, and and that was sort of with the educational institution for particularly focused on Black children, and I'll say a bit more later on, but that's the thing about why is it that we keep going back over the same thing. So I'm particularly interested in what's being said, that, you know, it's not a moment, it's a movement, and really the momentum and the opportunity to do things very different. I'm really encouraged and energized actually by what I'm seeing, particularly the fact that there's, you know, so this is for sure a moment where, yes, it's a moment where something is definitely shifted, but it's about whether we, you know, how do we continue that momentum, and how does it literally, I'm just thinking of those amazing scenes and the placards that are being carried, you know, and held up. And the one that stood out for me was, you know, racism is a pandemic. That one really, you know, and what do you do with a pandemic? Right? You want to eradicate it. You want to. So in terms of, you know, institutions, it goes very deep. It's generational. It's complex. It's all these things. And we all have our personal stories as well. So I'm very mindful of those of us, you know, joining us with this session right now, will be coming from different angles as well. And I just want to kind of mention that, because even terminology, there's conversations happening now about the term Black, right, in terms of the language that's being used as well, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that is an important point. For example, with us being based in Germany, there's this huge issue if it comes to certain words that you can use in English, for example, race, and the German word is a very different connotation, and so on. So it really depends on where you are also in that whole discussion. And maybe picking up on these things that you just mentioned also, Linett, with these continuities, with things having changed, but also we have seen a lot. And I think that's why also, I guess also that counts for us, are really also infected by it in a curate, but there, for me at least, there's still this last bit of skepticism, you know, because of course it's bigger than it had been before, but it's like just, okay, yes, how can we grasp this, and what does that mean? And that's why I wanted also to ask you, Sepake, working for an institution like Iniva, which is one of those major institutions who have done the work for like many decades ago and have been sort of paving the way, and have certainly contributed also to changing certain narratives by just saying we are building our own institution. It's not even about, you know, going into those structures of other institutions, but just doing that. Now it's, you know, would be really interesting to hear what that means to you, in a sense of, apart from maybe all sorts of people now suddenly asking you for statements or things like that, but also as someone who's worked intensively in education. So you have also not only that sense of being the leader of an institution, but also know how important education is if it comes to these questions.
So I think, you know, something that it might be the same for you, but it's definitely my experience actually from the moment of lockdown. There became a sort of moment of also institutions coming together. But maybe it's also this moment of crisis, right? So that, you know, in moments of crisis, you find other kind of radical forms of sharing knowledge, information. And so that was something that was quite interesting. And actually, again, this wave of coming together happened specifically, I would say, after the murder of George Floyd. So specifically, you know, Black artists, directors, artistic directors or curators or artists, and different generations, different geographies. And I think that as Iniva needs to be really a kind of platform that allows for conversations to happen between generations, because that's one thing I recognize, is that there's those conversations, they're happening with maybe, and it makes sense, of course, because in some ways that there is, if you're a generation of people coming out of art school at a similar time and you're showing work at a similar time, there's a kind of network of friends that would gather around practices. I know that there is also, I'd say, between different generations, there's been some frustration that there should be more help from the older generations because they've already been through it, and how could they support? In some ways, there's been some of those conversations going on. So partly I think it's important to allow those conversations to happen, in terms of, if the result of those conversations is that people decide that they need their own space, that's something that's important to allow to flourish. Iniva cannot be the only space. I think its importance for me is really about being a place which has an archive and a collection that shows there is a history to the practices that are emergent, and shows that there are also, there's a continuum of a dialogue that can happen between. So that's something I think that's really important. Also to say that about opacity is something I found is really important as well, which is that, one artist came to me and said, you know, myself and a number of other Black artists are being approached by different institutions to be part of their panels and their discussions, and we really think that Iniva needs to be the one to make this discussion. And I said, we need to perform a completely different set of politics.
Exactly, yeah.
Because for Iniva, it's not about performing the politics of Blackness. It needs to be a space that is enriching and supportive of artistic practice. But it's really important that those conversations are centered on the practices of those artists and how they want to bring their practice into the world, and not about performing a politics of Blackness for an institution. I think that's really important for us.
I think you touch upon a really interesting point about who should be leading on this conversation as well, in terms of that's happening in various forms. I saw someone had mentioned about, you know, being uncomfortable having those conversations. Again, I'm just thinking about, even there's lots of things out there in terms of terminology with unconscious bias and training. Again, it's like, with education plays such a massive part. I think the first thing is people need to become aware and need to know and to read up. And never in a time have we had so much information at our fingertips in a way that, you know, so it can almost be overwhelming, but it can also be people are sort of saying, but I don't know, what do I do? You know, all of these things. But I think that's a starting point in terms of at least get an understanding, and don't necessarily expect that to be a Black person or someone of colour to be the one to do that, because, you know, you talked about intergenerational conversations. It changes, right? So I'm from the generation, the age where, based on my parents' experience, they expected a certain standard with education, for example, right? So you could not really have that conversation, which was when I was growing up in London, in the UK schools in the 1970s and 80s, where we would be outright, you know, openly, you'd have teachers being absolutely racist with us and violent, and, you know, witnessed students being beaten up and so on, literally by the teachers. You could not then go back home and have that conversation and say that, because there was like no way that would happen. Of course, that's changed over time, but I think, and again, you know, there will be different dynamics with that depending on what you're experiencing in the environment that you're in. But I think that thing about, at least we all need to come from a place of understanding, and I would almost say kindness, right? Because sometimes it's really painful. And I do hear, and I get it with, you know, I'm going to be turning 50 this year, right? So I get it with the younger generation sort of saying, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you? You know, there is also that bit to understand as well. We're talking about deep traumatic experiences as well. So how do we even hold and deal with that side of things? And I'm really grateful. And it's things that I explore for my own work. I mean, that's why I use my art in that way. I was doing the whole thing around the state of education, I called it, where I didn't actually have the words to explore and to capture the huge grief that was out there, particularly for, if we talk again about institutions, often people will say, well, we don't have representation, there aren't enough Black people in leadership. Well, again, think about, well, why? What happens? It's not just about recruiting. It's not just about having someone on that panel or in that position or on that board or even in that job.
Yeah.
Look at what happens. How are they supporting it? I can go on and on. So there's a real, it involves everybody, but I think as well, just having that understanding that we are coming from different places. Yes, there's a unifying fact of the, again, talking about the experience of being Black and what that means globally, but then the different nuances of that. So another example I would give, I've met someone, again, quite doing, you know, out there doing lots of work, very well known, etc. And they said they hadn't really experienced racism in this country growing up. I was really shocked. I was like, wow, you know, someone had said that, and that just was not their reality. It's a rare thing to say, right? But there was that too. So I just think in terms of, while we're having these conversations, to also bear in mind the human, emotional, you know, that deep-rooted element as well, and that it's not just in the present, it's, you know, there's trauma sits within the body, right? So there's stuff that we might not even be aware of that will be stirred up as well, and that will be brought up when we're having these conversations. And I just feel that when, you know, we've all been busy and people are ringing, and absolutely, you know, we're seeing our colleagues and friends on the TV, and people, we've been just talking about this, we've been doing this work for a very long time. So it is a little bit, in a way, overwhelming, as I say, but how do we support each other? How do we go forward with this? Because, as I said, it's deep, challenging, uncomfortable, hard work, which can play a big toll, will take a big toll on people's mental health and well-being, for sure.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think one aspect, you know, you both talked about this generational aspect, and a big hope which we have as well, you know, by working with young people at Contemporary and the young generation. You know, we have such big hopes, and in you know, these the next generations growing up, you know, how their approach is maybe so different from our approach already, how they think about the world, even ideas of racism, etc. And this is, yeah, we have really big hope in the youngsters. And I was wondering, coming back to the question, how to challenge institutions to break the exclusive structures. You know, very often the argument of institutions, when you ask, why is your staff so not diverse? You know, why is it so white? Where are the non-white team members in your structure? The answers are very often like, oh, we would love to have you know, a more diverse structure, but they just don't apply. Or, you know, we couldn't find anyone, you know, to you know, to become part of the team, or, you know, we didn't have any applications by Black potential people to join our team, and obviously this is the wrong approach. And we wanted to ask you, why do you think this is a kind of lame excuse? Because you can always go the extra mile. This is something we do at Contemporary End as well. When we, for example, say we do mentoring programs with young art writers. For example, we do the current one in Egypt, and we wanted to invite young writers from Egypt who not necessarily have to write the texts for us in English, but in Arabic. If, for example, education-wise, they didn't attend an international school and learned English, yeah. And that's why we thought, no, we don't want to have the usual suspect English-speaking international educated young writers, but writers who feel more comfortable to write in Arabic. And that was an extra mile. It took us more emails, more phone calls, more, we had to dig deeper within our network to find these potential youngsters to apply, but we found them in the end. So the question is, what do you think this extra mile, or why is it important to go this extra mile and not, lean on this lame, no Black person applied, so that's why you don't have black people in the team?
Well, I can talk about our experience at 154. We're not an institution, but it's also the reality of things and concrete example. So first of all, our team has been very diverse over the years. Right now, it's not, but we are facing a situation where you often have to go from fair to fair, move from one action to another, and not automatically have the time to go the extra mile. And compared to the profile, that are already, applying, even sometimes without us asking for any, we don't have any vacancy. We're a very small team, but we already have a list of 10 or 15 CVs who are willing, to do an internship, work with us, do this. And we usually pick from what we already have or had recommended to us, or just because also we are running out of time usually. Now it's easy to say, and we all know, for example, the extra times would mean, to get more people from the continent. We obviously focus on Africa and the African diaspora, so for us, the right fit would be somebody who's, completely into this world, in terms of art, culture, etc. But there's different, also limitation in terms of, and maybe, you said the extra mile, but the visa issues are 1 mile that we have to face, They're coming here for education, then they have to leave back. So we're dealing with a circle of requirement. Of course, we could go the extra mile and wait and have another 6 months of, visa process and procedures and support. But there's also the reality of the business. It's a small business. It goes really fast, and we have to be ready to the next one. Now, saying all this, we are entering a new phase with the COVID, and things are getting slower, and obviously, we also have been criticized for not having more diversity in our team, and in our case is not having men in our team as well. We're a team of just girls, so in terms of being diverse, we have to go the extra mile on that one too. But we want to work with more organizations that could help us find the better profile, or be in mentoring program where we can mentor somebody to become the right profile for us, so this is definitely something we want to do. But the things we were not able to do before, it's also the pace of things in life, where we've been, kind of in a reacting mode all the time. And compared to maybe a big institution or a corporate world where you have an HR, department that can, make sure that those things are not happening. We are obviously a team of 4 and sometimes 6, so it doesn't often reflect, what we would like it to look like. But, based on different situation, we always try to have, the most diverse advisory board they could from the beginning since 2013. So in our case, we're able to definitely have a very interesting landscape of different board member from the continent, from the diaspora here. So that we've been very proud since 2013 to be able to include different African members of the board and, you know, African descent board members here in London from our forum and educational program. You know, we're able to choose also a curator every year, you know, that to include, you know, more diversity. But it is really challenging when it comes to recruiting, and this is where we find the most a challenge for us. Now, taking the time, working with organizations that exist, that, you know, we've been also guided towards to, will probably change that. And I think everybody should definitely make an effort in terms of creating the right environment by, you know, using the right organization to recruit better and hire, you know, better in diversity.
And I think it touches upon, I've just been like making some notes, just going back to, you know, how do we even get to the stage of getting an interview, right? You know, so again, I'm not going to go over things that many people watching this will be fully aware of, you know, in terms of applying. I've been, you know, someone who's been on that other side, having run 5 schools and trained school leaders and so forth. You know, you have that pile, and being that very often the only Black person around that table, you will see certain behaviours and you will call out certain behaviours, and rest assured there are consequences often if you do call out certain behaviours. So that's one of the things, and in fact it takes a lot, you know, if you think about, certainly, again, there'll be different experiences, but if you look at the data, sadly in too many sectors, but particularly if we talk about, again, in education, maybe where it starts again, how do you even get to the point where you can feel that you have enough skills to apply for a role? I would say any young person who's almost like survived some of these educational structures, right, to get to that point is going to be pretty awesome. But then there's the thing about positions of power, right? So who is the one to make those final decisions? When you get, of course, when you get to the interview stage, there's all of these unspoken things of behavior, how you look, what your hair looks like, all of these things, right? That all play into whether there is even that acceptance. And again, even that term, even me saying that acceptance, it's almost from a kind of deficit model, right? As if there's some issue here. But I think absolutely networks play a huge part. I would say, particularly to the younger people that I work with, or anyone that I'm kind of advising, like other artists, it's all about networks. It really is. And sometimes that, again, how do you have access to those networks? Who endorses you? Who introduces you, right? Again, I can speak with, you know, authority in the way of education in terms of it's a very small world in England, and with regards to Black educators and those who you know we've helped and I've helped, and those who've supported me. But also when you are there, who are you pulling up? Who are you supporting as well? So there's all these things playing on top of, which don't necessarily sit with. If we're talking about someone who is, and I'm going to focus, I'm going to keep saying the term Black because this is really what has generated and triggered or what's happened, right? We call it the Black Lives Matters movement, but it is that because there are degrees of, again, acceptance and so on. So I think there's a lot in there, but certainly taken, you know, just doing it. Just people need to be that one to call things out, and I think that's the issue. So people who are in those positions, they are aware, they know, and there's a moment where they're going to think, do I or don't? They make that decision, and it's often based on, unfortunately, selfish, I feel, possibly motives, because as I said before, there could be all sorts of consequences or ramifications of being the one to call out. Let's just call, you know, discrimination, racism, or whatever, but being bold enough and courageous enough, that's what's going to need to start happening. And it's going to need to be done by those who are sitting in those positions. And that's what I feel is quite, as I said, a real shift, and certainly in my lifetime, is I'm seeing more. I've never seen, for example, so many white people and young white people be at the forefront of this in terms of they are saying, they're speaking up. And I think that's really helpful, actually, because for many of as I said before, the younger, it's not an age thing, actually, you know, people are tired as well. And sometimes when you're tired, you need to be supported and carried. So there's lots of things around entry points, who provides access, and the pressures once you are there, you know, not to mess up and not to, you know, to get it right, because otherwise, oh my goodness. And it is, you know, this is what also is held against people, right? If someone, it's like, oh no, we can never again hire or appoint. Oh my goodness. So again, it's that whole thing that you become a colour or this thing, you know, not a person, not an individual.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of that has been said, and I think the issue is that institutions are still working with a rhetoric of diversity and inclusion, as opposed to thinking through, if we recognize, you know, racism in terms of it's a bias, right? So we have to then actively work against it. So you have to think through anti-racism and equity or equality, right? So and the language, even the language of diversity and inclusion is like sort of, like you mentioned, Linett, the word accepting, like who is accepting whom? So, but you know, even before that, I would say, you know, one of the experiences that has really helped me when I was kind of, you know, in my sort of starting jobs, I asked the question, I was in a kind of training program, and I'd asked the question, well, why do you think that your institution is so white? And I wasn't asking it to be provocative. I just wanted to understand, how is it that way when we're in London, you know, like one of the most diverse cities in the world. And the person, the head of education actually was really honest, and she said, because, you know, when you're white, you employ someone who not only looks like you, but sounds like you. So we're also now touching on a question of class. She was honest, and I was really appreciative of the brutality of the honesty. Is that then that's why you get this kind of, you know, homogenous groups of people who look and sound the same. So, but what does that do in terms of culture? That means you're also going to, if there is a kind of dominant sense of what should be within institutions, and we have to admit we're, you know, operating within systems of white supremacy. So, you know, what is the result of that? The result of that is that when you think, oh, okay, yeah, we need to be more diverse, and then you act in this kind of, actually in a kind of, in a way of thinking of through tokenism, and that's also not helpful.
Of course.
So it's not just a shift in, you know, institutional practice, it's a shift in our minds. There's a big shift that needs to be made, and that's not just for you know, white directors, it's also for Black directors. I mean, myself personally, I was never educated by a Black teacher. I've never had a Black teacher, not in my nursery, my primary, my secondary, my university education. I never had a Black teacher. So what does it mean? It means there's an element of self-education when you want to look outside the confines of your own education. Then you have to search for it yourself. And, you know, and that is a lifelong process of, you know, unlearning a lot of the things that you understand about yourself in some ways. It might mean listening to your mother a bit more than you would like to admit. It's like, you know, it's about understanding our kind of culture of, of maybe thinking much more, I guess, more about hybridity. So it's like about the fact that, you know, you might have like home cultures. So, you know, the way that you operate and act with your family and within your home. And then you have like this other culture that you know, just within maybe the workspace, the professional space. And I sort of think, you know, how do we reconcile these two cultures? How do we, and it's really, I mean, for me, I'm also mixed heritage. So, you know, sometimes when my mum would say, she's Jamaican, and she would say, oh, you know, we don't do that. She's talking about the Jamaican people.
Yes,
she's not talking about, my dad's side is the Nigerians, that, you know, we don't do that. That's another side. So it's like, complexity, you know, we have to deal with. And sometimes I think, within the kind of, let's say, because really to come back to this point of like, okay, so then what do we need to sort of shift within our practices? We need to understand that within the institution itself, we don't have all of the answers. So for example, when you are, if you really are truly wanting to make a shift within your organization, it's not just about recruitment processes, it's also about the ongoing care and infrastructure of care and support that is needed in order to sustain change within your organization. Because as we know, we're creatures of habit. So we will stick to what we know, but we need to, if we're going to stay within, you know, the trouble, if we're going to move with the feeling of feeling uncomfortable, or, you know, we need to work on it. It's not something that just is going to come to us naturally.
No, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, there's so many things we could obviously expand on, but we already need to come to our final question before we open up. And I would just like to kind of pick up on certain things that you said, in sense of what that means in the younger generation, but also, you know, coming back to our question, how we can challenge the institutions. I mean, Sepake, you already mentioned certain things, but also in a way, for example, the other day we were in a group Zoom with Black artists that are based here in Berlin, and we were talking about the concrete, like, requests not by requirements that we would, you know, and actions that should be implemented. So we can be very clear that it has to be about that. And also at the university where we are teaching, for example, we had this discussion where we said, actually, we were not interested in putting out a statement before we don't know what we're actually gonna do. So it has to be connected to that. And so in many ways, for example, when we talked with the group of Black artists, there was this, I think, interesting shift in a sense that many said, well, actually what many of us will do, those who can afford it, they won't take up any engagement if the institution doesn't meet the requirements that they should. So with really coming with that idea that, you know, often, as you all mentioned, many people are getting all these requests anyway, but even more like saying, okay, if there's like this theater or like this museum that want me on a panel, that want me to do a performance, and if I feel like this is very tokenistic because they put out this one statement and then now they're inviting me and I don't see how this is something that goes deeper, I say no. So it even went so far that this idea came up to build a fund for those artists who can't afford to say no, so that they can say no. So that they get then through that fund the means that they can, the support that they can survive. So I was just wondering whether there is something, that's the question to all three of you, that is maybe close to your heart, or that where you feel like now is the moment to really say, this is what should happen, or this is what we or the people I work with should ask for, or yeah.
Yes.
I suppose.
Of resources.
Sorry?
Sorry?
Oh, that's it. A restructuring of resources.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Linett.
Yeah, I say just hold into account, because one, what's positive is that on the one hand, yes, some statements are being made. There's a lot to be said about the silence. There's some organizations that could not even say anything. Because you all know, right? So on the one hand is that, so I think those that have come out and have said something, that's good, because great, well, and that's why there's been the challenge in a way, and it's also been the challenge for those that haven't, but it's about going forward. So how do we find solutions? So I would say, you know, I'm just thinking about how I've kind of often turned things around and have really shifted and brought about improvements. Sometimes even people think they can just write a policy. You can just say, we will not discriminate, right? Okay, well, let's look at that. Let's just pull that, you know, so some institutions, if you're, you know, you're on the one hand, it's about all the different departments, everyone speaking together and being aware of this. So there's no point a curator or a cultural organizer or whoever putting on this amazing, diverse, representational of artists from all over. And then I couldn't, for example, bring a group of students along because assumptions are going to be made, or they're going to be treated a certain way by security of the organization. It goes on every single level. So I haven't got like a simple answer to this, but definitely there's that thing for a holistic approach. I'm always mindful for that. I will look at all aspects, from what's written to what I feel and I see. I think that's the artist in me. I'm picking up on all the senses, right? Everything. And also speak to people. But, you know, we're talking about, not on the one hand, I'm not saying to find the solutions necessarily, because as I said, if you're not in that position of power, it sometimes can be difficult. But having a voice, being able to be given a voice and then to be truly listened, and then for there to be action. There's so much out there. I mean, I'm seeing incredible, you know, 10-point plans of this is what needs to happen. Yes, admittedly, I can go back to the 1960s and look at some documents that said the same thing. Right, we know this, but it's in the context of now, it's here. So the answers are there. It's about, let's put the resources, behind it. And let's stop just, you know, not just talking, it has to be action. And as I say, what's encouraged with each generation, they will do things differently. We are in the places we are because of those that stood before us and what they sacrificed. I'm very mindful of my heritage and the fact of being what I call, you know, I consider myself a living miracle, quite frankly. If I think about, you know, what's happened in terms of my lineage, right? Many others. So the fact that people, you know, there is that willingness, there are the ideas, and people want to, they've got the you know, the solutions. We've got many approaches. I think it's about doing something. It's not enough to just,
of course,
everyone, and as I'm saying, everyone who's here and who's joined us, you all in your own different ways. So again, I could pick any area. I would love to, I'll keep going back to young people, right? Because that's just my life. I've dedicated my life to work, because everyone will know of a young person. Everyone, and it does, and I'm not talking about what color they are, what background. You can take an interest in what's going on in that young person's life in terms of what they're being taught and educated. And you will have a way of, you know, helping and being alert and giving them a voice, because as I said, sometimes they won't have that voice. So it's about each of us being able to do what we can. And also, you know, what I loved as well, I saw there's been like so many beautiful things on Instagram where people have said, we all have different parts to play. Some of us are going on marches, some of us are writing letters, some of us are resting, you know, some of us are, and so forth. It's amazing, right? But we all, so there isn't, as you know, I know what you're saying with the question, but there isn't, of course, we know this one answer. But I think if I was to sum up, it would be like action. It is like, I'm not tired of waiting.
Yes.
What I wanted to say is that compared to the journey, you know, we started in 2013, there's been some positive changes as well. And I think Europe has definitely been, you know, definitely leading the way compared to the US in terms of inclusion, in terms of, you know, institutions taking a step in including even Black content, you know, into their collection. Too late, not enough, but there's been, you know, some positive action taking by some institutions. Now there's definitely, you know, this whole thing about the statement, you know, some did it, some didn't do it, you know, and I think as Linett said, what is important is being able to do your actions, you know, and to make sure that they actually are continuous and, you know, are happening. So for us, you know, to be fair, the sum of the statements, you know, that we've seen that fitted with us, you know, already, because championing the championing Black content in the art market, you know, we've been trying to do that since 2013, you know, sometimes very successfully, sometimes less, but doing what we are doing, and since 2013 we've been seeing, you know, progress. So it is also important to mention, not enough, not fast enough, and there's definitely a long journey to go. But what I would say is the continuity is very important. So we've seen a lot of art fairs, trying to include, African focus. And I remember Yvette and Julia, that you were part of this, curating in 2016, and that helped enormously, at the Armory show, for the galleries you were able to include, for that particular year. But again, it was a one-off, so it's all about not being one-offs, but rather, the continuity that is, very important, and even in those actions. So even for us, we might not have those discussions all the time, but I think our commitment is to have them regularly, as much as we can, because this is a topic that we cannot let go. But now, again, when I think about it, we have raised those questions since 2013 in our educational program as well. Was it enough, to do once a year a talk about this? Maybe we should do more, over the year, and it should be included, on a regular basis. But I definitely think the continuity of all our action is what will make the difference. It's like making sure that it's not, temporary movement. And they always tell me about African art the same way. Like, is it, a bubble is going to burst and nobody's going to care? And the truth is, like, everybody needs to care, and for a very long time, in the future. So this is what we're hoping. We're hoping that this is maybe, some action are being started now, but that they're going to be continuing in the future. And those panels are going to last for every institution wanting to have, artists being part of them, etc., in the future as well. But I mean, I needed to say that I've seen, some progress, not enough, but definitely towards, some institution trying to include more diversity. And obviously we're trying to be as encouraging as possible, for the future.
Thank you to all of you. So I think we should open up to a few questions. I'm afraid we might not be able to take all questions that came in. We would start with a question that was sent in by Sima Itabasa already before we started the talk. So she was the very first question. So, and so here it goes. A key part of dismantling oppressive structures involves giving up power. How do you think art institutions, particularly those in the West, can begin to give up structures that uphold the West as the hub of the art world? How do you create a system that does not require Western perspectives to validate what is or not is not art?
I'll take one part of that question because I think it's
sure.
So I've been thinking through the kind of radical democratic redistribution of power and resources and what that could mean for an institution. And so I'm sorry, the rain is really falling here, so I'm sorry if it's loud in the background, so I'll come closer.
It's getting dark, you see, we're so sitting in the dark. Yes, please.
But and so for me, I'm really thinking very much about like creating, like, I suppose, forums. And those forums have resources in order to enact or have to influence or shape or do part of the program. And so the difficulty, I think, for any director is that you have to relinquish some control, because you have to allow for a generative dialogue to shape part of your program. Whereas, of course, normally, I'm not a control freak, but like to select.
Oh, you said it. You are.
That's, for me, that's that is part of the curatorial privilege.
Yes.
Part of my curatorial privilege is that you follow practices for a period of time, and then you get into a dialogue with an artist. You do studio visits. You watch them, and then you have an opportunity to invite them. So what does it mean if part of that process is in a wider dialogue with other people, because and it's it's painful. But that's part of it. So that's one aspect. The other aspect I think is really important is is in relation to, and I don't know if it's much more in relation to sort of, we sort of see that, you know, our organizations, curating an exhibition still has a kind of, in a kind of hierarchy, those seem to be the things that take up greater resources within the institution, actually. Although I have worked in many institutions before where education and training are funded, and often part of those resources are also used somehow within the exhibition making. So I would like to also shift to center education and learning, you know, to shift the resources in this way, because actually maybe there's a greater benefit in the end in what might happen in terms of exhibition making. But I feel like you know, education and public programs, they're usually seen as secondary or research
and add-ons. Yes.
Yeah, and also there's a lot of invisible labor also in research. Like what would happen if I supported someone in the research more than I supported them in the you know, production, because there's all this emphasis on the making of the thing, whatever that thing is, and what could happen if I put so I think there are some ways to rethink, you know, the small pot of money that we receive. If anyone wants to, you know, continue to debate Iniva, of course, we're welcome to that. Because in the end, I was thinking about this, I was like, it's just paying forward, because all you do is that the funding that we receive is really supporting and nurturing the practices of artists. They are generating the culture for the future, which in the end comes back to the public anyway. So it's a circular economy. And so we need to find ways to continue. If we value culture, if we see it as valuable, then we need to continue to support it. But I just think that maybe when things go into the institution, there's a difficulty between the relationship between the institution and the artist, and that is this a power relation. We know this because the institution is the administrative body that gets the funding, that administers the funds to the artist. So I'm just wondering, you know, where can we shift in this aspect of that funnel of the funding? How can we use it to support some of the invisible labor and open up the decision-making processes?
I'd like to go as radical to say, and I don't think it's radical actually, but also that thing about culture, right? So culture, I'm a carnivalist, there's, you know, taking up space, resistance, you know, we're not waiting, we're just, it's born out of resistance and protest. And so this whole, I find it really fascinating. I move between the two different spaces with my own creative practice, with those that I work with, and where I take people and where I put my work, and where I see work that, again, it's that whole thing around endorsement. You know, there's that thing about, should it be, if it hasn't got the white walls around it, is that the space? And I just think there's lots of interesting aspects to with institutions, because the minute, and even the term, right, institution, already it's got connotations of what that's going to mean, and bureaucracy and rules and so on. We get that. So there's always this kind of interesting play, tension of where does culture, where does art, where do artists, creatives, where do they sit with these, in a way, gatekeepers? They hold money, you know, that's the funding. Because many, I'm sure, like there'd be many creatives who would just do that, and there's people just doing their thing anyway. And sometimes the institutions, often, not sometimes, all too very often, they're just catching up. Sometimes they're decades behind the scene of what's going on. So, which again is quite amusing. But there is that importance, because I want to bring up about narratives, and that's why I think the arts are so powerful. It's where, when we look back, who was there, who had a voice, who mattered. So that's why, you know, people say, oh, I'm not even engaging with this whole working with institutions, get rid of them, restructure, you know, completely all these art fairs and galleries and all of this. But, you know, that's a very, as I said, that's a whole radical approach, and that's okay. But at the same time, you know, there's a whole thing about archival, there's a whole thing about having those educational spaces. So I think there's value in aspects in both. And I think it's really, how do we kind of come from a position of really looking and deeply at these things in terms of who gets to say what is of value that sits behind and has security around it, and who gets to say, well, that's not valued, and that just gets this ephemeral, you know, it doesn't last long, it's just doesn't matter anyway. If it wasn't for the photographers or someone's phone or camera, would we even know it existed and happened? Yet it could be so much more impactful. And I just say that coming because I'm just thinking again all the time about the Notting Hill Carnival, for example, which is, you know, I'm the big part of, but there's that, for me, it's always made me look at an interesting way at these spaces, because, you know, especially when these spaces might try to, I say try, you know, but it's weird because things just don't transfer sometimes, right? I'm looking at that, you know, the whole dance hall scene, for example. There's elements, but it's really, I just find it fascinating that perhaps we need to look at the spaces as well of where culture, so-called, lives and sits and works, and how does it interact with institutions, and people in those positions, as I say, to not, there's a lot of guardedness, there's a lot of interest in terms of perhaps maintaining the status quo, not being taking a risk, shall we say, you know, because yeah, you might not know how it works out, but then if someone is courageous and does take that risk, not to come down heavy, you know, on them if it doesn't work out. We're all growing, we're all learning here, and we're all at different spaces, and as I said, on our own individual journeys. So I really, you know, I do like institutions. I do feel, I remember that moment, most people do, when they first went to a gallery, and I was like, wow, it's just something about being in and seeing something for real. And not a reproduction or just experiencing sound, whatever it is, well, whatever you call it, and where these interactions and these moments happen. But there is something I feel quite special about where there's a dedicated space where you can just take it in. It's different to when it's perhaps, as I said, just all action and it's kind of merged within everyday life. There is something about that pause. And it is kind of almost elevated, now rightly or wrongly, but there is something I think there to bear in mind as well. And I think if we think about those impactful moments, you know, so many creatives, you go back, you talk to them, when was that moment for you? And it wasn't it when they had that first, I'm not just talking about a visual piece of art, it could be when they heard someone singing, or when they, you know, there was that space for that to happen, is what I'm referring to.
Well, I think from institutions, you know, the problem is like we're going to see slow changes because of the funding, and depending where the funding is coming, you know, usually, unfortunately, in the past, it came from, you know, not automatically sources that will, you know, want to fund specific, you know, alternative project or project including, you know, Black artists. And unfortunately, we've seen it in the past like this. So I think maybe the future is to alternative spaces, you know, that, you know, have, you know, that mission, you know, rather than trying to rely too much on the old institutions, but maybe flexible spaces that can be more adaptable to what, you know, we want to see in them, you know, and might not be depending on also, unfortunately, white collectors, you know, giving money to a museum, or, you know, corporate banks giving money to a museum with a certain, I mean, institution that won't have to decide to allocate, you know, officially part of their money to do something like that, you know. And this is what we will hope we'll see with this movement have started, that maybe, you know, there's going to be funded, allocated to change education, to change, you know, what we see in exhibitions. But unfortunately, I mean, the system is, I feel really bad, because with the fair, you know, people in the beginning when I started it were telling me, you know, why do you think those artists were never included in the, you know, in the narratives? And the truth is that, you know, it all came to, you know, playing by the rules as well, you know. So for, you know, artists or creatives who don't want to play by the art rules as it is today, it is also very difficult, you know, to get them into the right galleries, to get them into the right institution, because there's a bit of a, you know, of a circuit that they have to go to arrive or to achieve a certain visibility. So I think we have to make sure that they are part of those, you know, those games and those rules, even if we don't like them, because at the end of the day, I don't think all is going to change in, you know, in one day. So to make sure we achieve, the visibility they deserve, the changes we want to see, we want to make sure that, we understand how it's played and make sure that we are able to be part of the discussions and, the rules as well. And I think maybe with the movement, this is what we're been able to achieve right now, is making sure that this voice is heard and is, around the table and is able to be voiced. And hopefully this is all that we can actually hope that this is going to be achieved through maybe shifting the way the funding is distributed. And this has to be, maybe a policy from the institutions, that has to be there. It doesn't matter who gives the funding, it has to go, a certain amount has to go to developing such activities. But it's very difficult, even in terms of, the grants that maybe a museum receive or artwork that museums receive, institutions receive today. There will be people probably, I don't want to use this term, but white collectors granting the work to a museum, and if you think about what they've been collecting over the years, it's definitely not Black, artists or Black content, so even in terms of acquisition, it takes a longer time. Should be more funding coming from the museum to acquire, maybe artists, from a diverse background.
Yeah.
You touched on it, sorry, it just made me think about a term of that thing of white sanction. That's kind of the issue as well, wasn't it, what you were saying about the rules. And this is, I think, what's very much at the moment, people are sort of questioning, like they always have been, but I feel that there's an energy to say, well, is there space? Can we start doing things differently? And can we look at these rules? And because money is, this is it. It's a major factor. Without the funds, without the money, and it does just, affect so much, and decisions that are made, and what happens to artists as well, who kind of so-called make it and get there, and all of these things that you've touched upon, Touria, that need to be brought into the mix and considered, because that also can affect change. Yes, and maybe slow down change, as I said before, but money's a big one.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a last question. Of course, there are many questions, but we ask you a last question, and would love to have it short, as short as possible. So, how can new emerging talents within the arts challenge institutions, even at the initial point of an open call? What advice would you give us, aside from building creating spaces for creatives on our own? What advice would you give us, aside from building a creative space for our creatives on our own? So
I would say, first of all, unity is a big thing, because I think if you're talking about creatives as in a group, I think that's what I don't know if that's the question's referring to, rather than just as an individual. But with art, there's always been that thing about shock, isn't there? And I'm not saying to do something outrageous, but looking back in time, it's really people that kind of did something that was a bit, oh my goodness, it shifted people's thinking. It got them. There was something that got them to engage with, or it made them think differently about something. And there's sometimes a bravery or an authenticity there as well. So I think there's something about just being who you are, because often, as I say, if you're lucky enough to be on this planet long enough, things just come back around anyway. So just keep doing what you're doing, believe in yourself, and I say the unity thing, because it's not just about, oh, when I'm going to get there, and what does that mean anyway? I've said that with education. I kind of got to the top of the mountain, there was nothing up there, kind of thing. So I'm bold.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I do think there is a lot to be said about making something happen outside of the institution, because actually that's often the thing that makes institutions look at what's happening.
Yes.
So there's a lot to be said also of like, you know, there have being a kind of, you know, a collection of people, no, working together to something. And I think that's about sort of getting to know your peers and supporting each other and creating that space for each other, or holding space for each other. But I definitely think, you know, when I think about, I also wanted to say, like, just being bold enough sometimes to approach people and institutions, like, and invite people to things. Because I think that there is this sense of like, you know, there are humans working in institutions. So, you know, like if I get an invitation to something and if I can make it, I'll try and make it, you know. So I just think there's nothing wrong with this, like, you know, just like, because I think especially in the UK, I really feel that there's such a huge hierarchy in conversation. You're the curator who works there, or, you know, but actually we're also just human. So we need to kind of, also I think for, you know, us working inside institutions, I think it's really important to work out how we can open up our door and even just make space for the unexpected to happen, you know. So that's also something maybe in a restructuring, you know, maybe I sort of take half a day and I say there's no meetings, but that's for a moment for people to sort of call or to come or whatever. So I think, you know, we need to kind of, you know, I just think that this is a really important moment for us not to, you know, we're all in our houses, do you know what I mean? Like we're all like doing these conversations right now in the places that we live, you know. So my institution is in Peckham, so you're not you know, there's no, do you know what I'm just trying to,
we know what you mean.
If you're going to area drop, I've got to put Harleston in there, sorry, you know, Kilburn.
I was like South East London, like put it in at the end, you know. Anyway.
I was just going to say just very quickly, there's access though, right? So I think that people are doing that, but it's about how can you get them to look through all the traffic and to pay attention to someone perhaps who doesn't have the blue tick, who doesn't have all, you know, it's that visibility thing. It is a challenge, and I'm not sure, but maybe it is that, like, put some time in their diaries where they seek out those that aren't maybe aren't amplified enough. Their voices aren't amplified, but they are pretty amazing. There's so many people out there like that, and not to be so lazy.
Thank you so much. I think we really have to wrap up now because there might be like a limit on the Zoom.
And then we're all gone.
So it's better to say bye.
So frustrating.
1 minute.
Thank you so much, everyone.
It
was a very great conversation. I really
thanks for the invitation, and thanks for all the people that are like stayed with us.
Yes, exactly.
Really great.
Sending the recording to everyone, the people who registered and the people on our
look at all the thank yous. This is so amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, look at them.
For your great work that you do, and we just continue.
I'm looking forward to
keep on doing the great work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whenever that is, maybe live next year. Hopefully earlier, but
exactly.
We'll see each other. Okay.
Have a good evening.
Bye. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.